Thanks, Rob. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to give a talk on the role of tenofovir and dolutegravir in second-line antiretroviral therapy. So I'll focus on results from the NADIA and ARTIST studies, two randomized controlled trials conducted in sub-Saharan Africa, investigating the virologic efficacy of second-line TLD regimen. By way of introduction, in HIV-positive patients who had virologic failure on a regimen that contains a non-nucleoside such as nevirapine and faggots, the WHO recommendation for second-line regimen is dolutegravir plus 2 nucleosides. WHO also recommends that nucleosides should switch from tenofovir to cytopenia. This is to ensure that at least one fully active nucleoside accompanies dolutegravir, because low and middle income countries have limited access to resistance testing to select an optimized nucleoside background regimen. This recommendation was based on one randomized controlled trial that used resistance testing to select nucleosides and excluded patients with no predicted active nucleosides, which show that dolutegravir plus 2 nucleosides was superior in safety and efficacy to ritonavir boosted lopinavir plus 2 nucleosides, achieving 84% virologic suppression at week 48 compared with 70% in the lopinavir ritonavir arm. Questions have been raised about what constitutes an optimized nucleoside background regimen and how dolutegravir would perform when used unprotected by predicted active nucleosides, and whether maintaining recycling tenofovir and lamivudine with dolutegravir can provide an effective second-line regimen. Cytopenia, as we know, is dosed twice daily, which makes adherence difficult and is associated with increased risk of anemia, and therefore is less well tolerated than tenofovir. Maintaining tenofovir in second line, which can be given with lamivudine and dolutegravir as a once daily fixed dose combination, is more attractive for patients and programs. And the NADIA and ARTIST study were designed to investigate this alternative paradigm. The aims of the NADIA trial was to determine whether dolutegravir is non-inferior to darunavir and whether maintaining tenofovir and lamivudine is non-inferior to switching to cytopenia and lamivudine in a population with substantial baseline nucleoside resistance and no resistance testing to select nucleosides. 464 participants in Uganda, Kenya, and Zimbabwe failing on a tenofovir, entrectinib, and non-nucleoside regimen, with 2 viral loads above 1,000 copies were enrolled. They were randomized to receive either dolutegravir or ritonavir boosted darunavir, and in a second factorial randomization to receive either tenofovir or cytopenia, each with lamivudine. The primary outcome is virologic suppression below 400 copies at week 48. Over 90% had suppression below 400 copies in both dolutegravir arm and darunavir arm. Looking at the efficacy comparison of tenofovir and cytopenia arm for the primary outcome, again, close to 90% had suppression below 400 copies in both arms. The NADIA investigators therefore concluded that dolutegravir is non-inferior to darunavir and tenofovir is non-inferior to cytopenia. The 96 weeks follow-up results of NADIA trial caused more doubt on the WHO recommended algorithmic nucleoside switching to cytopenia when starting second-line therapy. At week 96, superiority of maintaining tenofovir versus switching to cytopenia was demonstrated for the outcome of virologic suppression below 400 copies. Dolutegravir remained non-inferior to darunavir, and close to 90% had suppression below 400 copies in both arms. Resistance testing was done for confirmed viral rebound to above 400 copies. Importantly, 9 participants with confirmed viral rebound in the dolutegravir arm, including 7 with viral rebound above 1,000 copies, had major dolutegravir resistance mutations associated with intermediate or high-level dolutegravir resistance, whereas none of the participants in the darunavir arm with rebound developed major darunavir resistance mutations. Here are the profiles of participants with emergent dolutegravir resistance. Of the 9 cases with dolutegravir resistance, 6 occurred in participants taking cytibudine. Here at the 6 cases in the cytibudine group, 5 had high-level resistance, 4 with mutation at 138 and 1 with mutation at 148. The 6 cases had intermediate resistance with the 263 mutation. For the 3 cases in the tenofovir group, all had intermediate resistance and all with the 263 mutation. The NADIA study demonstrated that dolutegravir and 2 nucleosides give excellent and durable biologic suppression in second-line therapy, even if given with no predicted active nucleosides. This supports the WHO recommendation for dolutegravir use in second-line therapy. High-level dolutegravir resistance is a concern, and more data is needed for longer-term use. Dolutegravir is non-inferior to, darunavir is non-inferior to dolutegravir, meaning that darunavir is a robust alternative to dolutegravir in second-line therapy. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, maintaining tenofovir was virologically superior to switching to cytibudine at week 96, suggesting that the WHO recommended algorithmic nucleoside switching to cytibudine when starting second-line therapy may need to be revised. The ARTIST study is conducted in Cape Town. It was designed in 2 sequential stages to investigate the use of TLD regimen in second-line therapy. And similarly to the NADIA study, in a population with substantial baseline nucleoside resistance and no resistance testing to select nucleosides. We know from previous studies that nucleoside resistance impairs viral thickness, and compromised nucleosides have proven effective in protease inhibitors-based regimen. Dolutegravir, like protease inhibitors, has a high genetic barrier to resistance. The aim of the first stage of ARTIST was to determine whether recycling tenofovir and immunotherapy with dolutegravir can provide an effective second-line regimen. In the first stage, 62 participants failing on the tenofovir and tristabine and non-nucleoside regimen with 2 virals above 1,000 copies enrolled and switched to a second-line TLD regimen with a lead-in dose of dolutegravir 50 mg daily for the first 14 days, followed by, 50 mg twice daily for the first 14 days, followed by 50 mg daily until week 48. This dose adjustment of dolutegravir will ensure that dolutegravir 12 concentrations remain comparable to the usual 50 mg daily dose, despite the efavirenz induction effect on dolutegravir metabolism and transport that lasts for 2 weeks after efavirenz start. The study duration is 48 weeks, and we are following up patients to 3 years. The primary endpoint is the proportion with a viral load below 50 copies at week 24. We also looked at other outcomes, including virologic suppression at 12 and 48 weeks, change of CD4 count and safety, as well as emergence of dolutegravir resistance. Here are the baseline characteristics of the study population. On average, people were young with an average age of 37, majority of women. Baseline CD4 count was 248, and baseline viral load was greater than 10,000 copies. Resistance testing results were available in 54 participants, and 2/3 were resistant to both tenofovir and darunavir when starting second-line. Resistance testing was defined by a Stanford score greater than or equal to 15, which indicates low-level, intermediate, or high-level resistance. The majority of participants were taking a efavirenz-based regimen prior to switching, and only 1 participant was on the therapy before enrollment. Here are treatment outcomes at 24 weeks. 85% had virologic suppression below 50 copies, and 95% had suppression below 400 copies. One had a viral load of 755. All 7 had repeat viral load that we suppressed. One met criteria for resistance testing, which is having a viral rebound, followed by a repeat viral load that's above 500 copies despite adherent support, and dolutegravir resistance mutations were not detected. One switched tenofovir to cytidine due to acute renal impairment in relation to tenofovir. One did not have a viral load done and was lost to follow-up. There was no treatment discontinuation due to failure. At week 48, 78% had virologic suppression below 50 copies, and 87% had suppression below 400 copies. 4 had viral load above 1,000, 3 later resuppressed, and the other 2 viral load of 434. 2 were eligible for resistance testing, and dolutegravir resistance was not detected. And at week 72, 75% remained virologically suppressed below 50, and 84% remained suppressed below 400 copies. 2 had viral loads above 1,000, 1 later resuppressed, and the other had repeat viral loads that remained above 1,000 and reported some optimal adherence. Both participants had resistance testing and showed no dolutegravir resistance. Efavirenz induces several drug metabolizing enzymes and transporters involved with dolutegravir metabolism and transport, resulting in subtherapeutic dolutegravir concentrations when switching from efavirenz to dolutegravir, particularly in individuals carrying CYP2B6 slow metabolizer genotype. In CYP2B6 slow metabolizers, which has a prevalence of around 20% in South Africa, higher efavirenz exposure leads to greater induction effect and therefore a more prolonged period of subtherapeutic dolutegravir concentrations post-switch. There is little concern for patients who switch with a suppressed viral load because at no time should both dolutegravir and efavirenz concentrations simultaneously fall below therapeutic concentrations, and efavirenz would protect dolutegravir during its period of low exposure. However, in patients switching with continuing, in the presence of continuing viral replication and efavirenz resistance mutations, in a population with substantial baseline nucleoside resistance, exposure to subtherapeutic dolutegravir concentrations could increase the risk of dolutegravir resistance. The genetic barrier against dolutegravir resistance may not be optimal when dolutegravir is administered with 2 compromised nucleosides. And resistance has been reported in NADIA, as I've shown, as well as other clinical trials and programmatic settings, where patients transition from efavirenz to dolutegravir without dolutegravir dose adjustment. The aim of the second stage of ARTIST was to determine whether a lead-in supplementary dolutegravir dose will reduce the risk of dolutegravir resistance and treatment failure. The second stage of ARTIST is a non-comparative, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled phase 2 trial. 130 participants failing on the tenofovir, ampicillin, and non-nucleoside, efavirenz regimen with 2 viral loads above 1,000 copies were enrolled. They were randomized to receive TLD regimen with a lead-in supplementary 50 mg dolutegravir dose or placebo, taken 12 hours after the fixed dose combination tablet for the first 14 days, followed by TLD regimen daily until week 48. The primary endpoint is proportional with a viral load below 50 copies at week 24. The pooled analyses of week 24 results show that over 80% had suppression below 50 copies, and over 90% had suppression below 400 copies. Of 8 participants with confirmed viral rebound who were eligible for resistance testing, none of the participants had dolutegravir resistance mutations. We are at the stage of analysis and we'll be able to share results by later this year. Results from both stages of ARTIST demonstrated excellent virologic suppression with second-line TLD, despite 2/3 of stage 1 participants having no predicted active nucleosides. Most not suppressed had low-level viremia and subsequently suppressed with adherent support. Results from both NADIA and ARTIST represent a paradigm shift, showing that changing only one drug in a failing first-line regimen could provide an effective second-line option due to the robustness of dolutegravir and residual activity of compromised nucleosides. Final results from ARTIST stage 2 will address whether patients who had unsuppressed or unknown viral load on first-line TLD regimen may safely switch to second-line TLD without dolutegravir dose adjustment. I'll briefly talk about the week 48 results of the ASCENT trial, recently presented at CROI. The aims of the ASCENT trial were to determine whether dolutegravir with recycled nucleoside is non-inferior to a boosted PI with new nucleoside, and whether the combination of TDF and lamivudine is non-inferior to TAP and emtricitabine when combined with dolutegravir. 1,200 participants in Zambia on a tenofovir, emtricitabine, and non-nucleoside regimen were enrolled. Participants with viral load below 1,000 were randomized to receive either TDF and lamivudine or TAP and emtricitabine, each with dolutegravir. Participants with viral loads above 1,000 copies were randomized to receive either TDF, either TLD, TAP-OD, cytopidine lamivudine with ritonavir boosted atazanavir, or cytopidine lamivudine with ritonavir boosted lopinavir. The primary outcome is virologic suppression below 1,000 copies at week 144. At week 48, over 80% had suppression below 1,000 copies in both arms in arm A. And in participants with baseline viral loads above 1,000, both TLD and TAP-OD regimen demonstrated superiority in virologic suppression below 1,000 copies and below 50 copies compared to a boosted PI plus cytopidine and lamivudine. The ASCENT investigators therefore concluded that second-line therapy with dolutegravir and recycled tenofovir and lamivudine has better outcomes compared to a protease inhibitor regimen using a new nucleoside backbone. So in conclusion, NADIA, ARTIST, and ASCENT addressed a weakness in the evidence base for WHO second-line recommendation, which is whether the recommended switch from tenofovir to cytopidine is really necessary, or whether patient can simply continue with tenofovir and lamivudine and change the third drug from efavirenz to dolutegravir. Results from 3 studies support WHO recommendation for dolutegravir use in second-line therapy and support switching to dolutegravir where pre-switch viral testing is not available. These results have led to an update from the South African HIV Clinician Society, recommending that all adults on tenofovir, emtricitabine, and non-nucleoside regimen be switched to TLD regimen regardless of viral results. So I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Sorry, we got a hello. Okay. Hello, can you hear me now?
Just turn your volume.
Okay, I'm going to go next door.
If you turn the volume down. Okay.
I'll tell you what. I'll turn this on and we can response. Okay, so thanks very much. We're still trying to get our heads around this new seminar room, so apologies to colleagues, but thank you very much Ian, for that really excellent talk, beautifully presented and very clear. If colleagues would like to raise their hands on the participants, we can tell who'd like to speak. Gary, you put your hand up. Over to you.
Hi, yes, thank you, Ying. Great summary of current state of the art. So when we designed ARTIST Stage 2, this issue of the need for extra supplemental dose of dolutegravir in the first 2 weeks seemed quite important, but I think it's probably become less important with time. So I think that's hopefully that won't be required. I mean, I know it's silly to say that now before we've unblinded, but I do think that that's probably not going to be necessary. One point, though, that I don't know if you highlighted enough is that, yes, dolutegravir has a high genetic barrier to resistance, but PIs have a higher genetic barrier to resistance, because in both Dawning and NADIA, no PI resistance was detected at all. Eventually, it might have developed, but even in the long-term follow-up of Ernest, for instance, and Dawning, that did not happen. So that, to me, is a worry, that now we've got dolutegravir in first line and everyone's going to have it in second line, and it's also in third line, that in second and third lines where we're going to start to see dolutegravir resistance emerging. And what do you think we should be doing as a country to monitor that or to circumvent that? What do you think the future should hold for us?
Well, I think, like you said, dolutegravir likely has a lower genetic barrier compared to protease inhibitor, and not only in the long-term follow-up data of NADIA and Dawning, dolutegravir resistance has emerged in programmatic settings where patients with virologic failure transition from efavirenz to dolutegravir. So I think regarding long-term follow-up, I think in the 96-week paper of NADIA, the investigator pointed out that most patients who developed dolutegravir resistance had multiple occasions where they indicated, where they reported suboptimal adherence. So I think it's really important to continue with intensive adherence monitoring and a repeat viral load soon after the adherence interventions. And those visits are potential opportunities to prevent the emergence of dolutegravir resistance. There's also indication that patients who switch from efavirenz to dolutegravir with unsuppressed viral load above 1,000 copies or unknown viral load had worse treatment outcomes in terms of a viral rebound to more than 1,000 copies and pulmonary tuberculosis, as well as the other WHO clinical stage 4 event on dolutegravir regimen. So I think patients who switch from efavirenz to dolutegravir with high viral load or unknown viral load is a particularly vulnerable group that is at high risk of developing dolutegravir resistance and should and may benefit from intensive clinical monitoring and adherence support.
Thanks very much. So Gary, do you want to come back on that, or are you happy?
I mean, I think that Ying is correct, but unfortunately in programs, close monitoring and watching is tricky. And I think that we have a national ARV resistance surveillance set up that clearly needs to now focus obviously on dolutegravir resistance. But my worry is that they're not going to be able to figure out easily who is on TLD for second line and who is on it for first line. So I'm just concerned that the existing surveillance is going to be too crude for us to really properly monitor it. Because if you look in first line, you're hardly going to find anything. But in second line, you may well find something.
Yeah, just to make a point and then kind of pick up on Gary's comment is that the bigger public health picture as well is that in many other African countries, they've been transitioning to TLD without checking a viral load and just moving all patients from first line to TLD. And so, the majority of patients have been switched. And the PEPFAR data from those programs has shown impressive improvements in viral load suppression. Up to, 5% or more absolute increase in viral load suppression in the year or two after switching. And so that, on a public health level, that shows that, in addition to this data, that switch is having a positive impact. In South Africa, we've obviously delayed doing that because our algorithms say you have to have a viral load and if you suppress, then you make the switch. And so South Africa has been far behind many other African countries in the switch to TLD, therefore hasn't seen the same benefits. Obviously, that being said, as Gary points out, there are huge benefits to the switch to TLD, but it doesn't come without negative consequences, and that is that there will be a small group of people who will develop dolutegravir resistance. And I think that, to pick up on that, in addition to what Ying said about adherence and close monitoring, we need to develop strategies for broader testing for dolutegravir resistance now. And we actually just need to test the integrated gene. We don't need to be testing the NRTIs first of all. And I think strategies that potentially pool specimens, because it's going to be quite rare at the start. So we looking in, I think that's one thing, you're looking at pooling and looking for mutations, and then if there are mutations, then to isolate, the specimen where the mutations are. Cheaper options in terms of sequencing the integrates that just allows us to do more surveillance, but also to offer broader testing for this, the single dolutegravir resistance and identify those patients. And then if we can identify them, then we have a great salvage strategy, as Ying said, because if those people have failed TLD, they'll do well on ritonavir and tenofovir and glucosamine. So, but the key issue is to be able to identify them from the people that are failing due to non-adherence.
So thanks very much. I think Lucas, you wanted to.
Thanks. I want to ask, you showed that nice table about from the NADIA trial showing that the tenofovir dolutegravir group has less extensive resistance, even though statistically you can't really prove that, but it looks very suggestive. Do you know anything about the time of failure? Because you can also posit that maybe tenofovir just delays the occurrence of failure and makes the accumulation of integrase resistance sort of slow down compared to ACT3PC, and it's just a time effect that we're seeing. Or is that not really known from now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to look into that.
I think there's going to be a follow-up paper on the resistance and the characteristics of those patients. It wasn't presented in detail in the primary publication.
Yeah, in the last study, you showed a 50% study. The AZT lopinavir was only 62% suppressive. Why it's so bad in comparison, do you think?
I suspect it's due to that regimen is fully tolerated, and so the patient might continue because of side effects. It was a conference presentation, so it was explained in detail. But I suspect it's the same as indolence, as dolutegravir is more achieved higher proportion efficacy because of tolerability.
And lastly, just before we move to our second case, I'm not sure if any virology colleagues dive on the call. I mean, to speak to Graham's point about the need to, focus down on on tailored, almost bespoke resistance testing. And I guess in terms of the genes that we're looking at, I mean, is there any movement in genotype testing in HIV that would allow that you could just get dolutegravir raised gene mutation testing? Is there anything that could be point of care in clinics coming available? Sorry to put you on the spot, Diane. Right, now. Anybody on the call got any understanding of that? Okay, well, that would be useful.
Not point of care, but with the new sequencing techniques that have been become more wide scale with COVID, those discussions are occurring about using those platforms for those benefit of data.
Okay, fantastic.
We use point mutation assays developed but that was for family resistance. And the problem is with entities now you have to completely redevelop the assay for the new mutations.
I mean, is there a wide range of mutations, or are there kind of one or two dominant ones that you target with the PCR test?
You mentioned a couple of dominant ones, 283.
Yeah, I think there's probably 5 to 10 that have been seen to be associated with dolutegravir resistance. So it's not that easy. I think you're probably going to need a sequence.
Okay, fantastic.